Yes, please.
And play from start?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
And then I'll just ask you to move it along.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you so much. That's appreciated. So,
Welcome.
so this project is one where what I'm trying to do is look at, I've studied constitutions and constitution making for many years. And what I'm trying to understand is whether when we look at constitutions in Africa, whether we can look at the process of constitution making and learn anything from that. So that's the basic where I'm coming from. So let's go to the first slide. And this is, of course, the Berlin Conference and the division of Africa in that, the partition of Africa. And the notion here is that the so-called modern state is imposed on Africa beginning through this process, through this colonial process. Prior to that, Africa, of course, had many states and empires and governance of its own. But the focus here really is on the notion of what happens in this colonial period. So the next slide. And of course, what's important here is that we get independence. So the African states start getting independence. There's a famous photo from the first moment of independence in Sub-Saharan Africa with Kwame Nkrumah standing next to Charles Auden Clark at the Ghanaian independence ceremonies in 1957. Next slide. And of course, that process of independence goes on. My only problem with this slide is South Africa 1949. It should be 1994. But this is the general process of independence over the years in Africa. Next slide. But of course, we know that after independence, very shortly thereafter, we have this process of coups d'etats throughout Africa. I highlight here, of course, the Ghana coup d'etat in 1966, but of course it starts much earlier in Congo Kinshasa and then Togo. But there's this whole process, and this is just the first 10 years, from 1960 to 1969, and multiple coups in some countries. So if we're thinking about governance in the so-called modern state in Africa, we cannot ignore this process. Next slide, please. And here's just a depiction. What's interesting, of course, is where the concentration of multiple coups have taken place. And it is across the Sahel area more than anywhere else. But again, this is just the cases where there have been coups d'etats. Next slide. And what's, of course, important for the moment is that we've had a series of coups d'etats since 2020. So there was a period when you had these earlier coups d'etats, and then particularly after 1989, we saw a break, a period of time when we did not see as many coups d'etats. And then suddenly there's this set of coups d'etats between 2020 and 2023. The next slide, please. And, if we just take this one photo of the coup in Niger in 2023, the striking thing is to see the population turning out in celebration of supporting these military leaders as they step in. And that's also going to be a question that I want to hold in front of us today. The next slide. And the geographic location, once again, is across the Sahel, Gabon being the exception. But what's interesting about this is that the reasons behind it may, of course, be much broader than merely political failure. It may also be impacts of climate change and other issues, why this particular area of Africa has been impacted. But the fact is that we've had these coups d'etats, and in many cases, popularly received by the population. Next slide, please. So the puzzle is why do people celebrate when the military stages a coup d'etat and abrogates the constitution? One explanation being that constitutions of newly independent states are often imposed on them by the former colonial powers and so do not belong to the people. I want to take a broader view today and begin by identifying changing modes of constitution making across Africa to explore the relationship between these different processes and constitutional resilience. In other words, does greater public participation engender a greater commitment to constitutionalism? That's the question I'm trying to grapple with. Next slide, please. So Professor Funmi Adeoye in 2011 wrote a piece where she argued that the continued failure of the rule of law in Africa can be traced to the foundation of the law that is in force in most African countries, the Constitution. That the constitution-making process in many African countries, she argued, is devoid of popular input, devoid of consent of society, and does not reflect the values of the people. Greater participation, she argued, induces a self-binding commitment to the Constitution and other laws of the land in the people. So here is a 2011 argument that I'm trying to explore in this piece. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's been a lot of discussion about waves and of constitution making across Africa. And of course, one can think about it in that kind of metaphor of waves. You have the pre-independence, post-independence, then the Republican one-party wave, and then eventually the post-Cold War wave. So people talk in terms of waves of democracy, waves of constitutionalism, but I want to think about it more in terms of the forms of constitution making itself. So I'm going to identify these 5 general forms and go through each one of them just as a way for us to understand or think about this. Let's start. Let's go to the next slide, please. So you have these imposed pre-independence constitutions. So the so-called modern state in Africa outside of the settler states. So of course, the settler states, as Mahmoud Mamdani argues, created a bifurcated state, a state where on one hand, the settlers were given so-called democracy by the British, while the majority of the population were excluded and put under authoritarian system of control, whether that was in Kenya or South Africa, but those settler states. Outside of the settler states, the colonial regime imposed a number of constitutions. Next slide, please. So the example I'm using is Nigeria between 1914 and 1960, a series of constitutions. Next slide, please. So, and what's interesting, of course, is many of these constitutions were named after the colonial governor that actually put them in place. So you have the Clifford Constitution in 1922, the Richards Constitution in 46, the Macpherson Constitution in 51. All 3 were governors, colonial governors of Nigeria. But the Littleton Constitution in 54, the last colonial constitution, is actually by the Secretary of the Colonial Office, Littleton. And so this series of constitutions is an attempt by the colonial regime to govern through constitutional means. Next slide, please. So what's interesting about these constitutions, it wasn't that these constitutions were only designed by the colonial power. There was a lot of agitation and by the emerging nationalist forces in Africa. And for instance, by the time you have the 54 constitution adopted in Nigeria, you have a process where the majority of the people in the room, as this photo indicates, are in fact Nigerian, are African. However, the way the conference and the organization was structured was to ensure that the majority of the people in the room were not independently elected or from the nationalist movement. In fact, Dr. Zikwe, the nationalist movement, the leader of the nationalist movement, boycotts these processes because the people sitting in the room are people who are chiefs that have been recognized by the colonial powers and are cooperating to a certain degree, although often they do in fact suggest certain things be put in those constitutions. Next slide, please. Of course, what happens with the rejection of the 54 constitution is the push for independence. And so Nigeria gets independence in 1960. Next slide, please. We go to the next slide. Thank you. So those were those pre-independence constitutions. No, sorry, the one before this. So those are those pre-independence constitutions. And then there are the independence constitutions. No, next one, please. Then there are the independence constitutions. And the independence constitutions are often termed the Lancaster House constitutions. That's because this Lancaster House model is a model of negotiation, but also imposition, where the drafts of these constitutions are produced by the colonial office. They're presented to nationalist leaders who can negotiate for some elements of them before they are then adopted by the British government and then sent on to the colonies at independence. Next slide, please. So, you know, the classic one, the first one here being the Ghanaian constitution. The constitution itself comes, as you can see here, as an order in council. So the Parliament, the British Parliament, passes an independence statute, and attached to that statute is an order in council, often an addendum, which includes the constitution of the country that's gaining independence. I love this slide because it indicates that this change from Gold Coast to Ghana, but also happens in March 1957, literally 1 month before I was born. Next slide, please. And here is Kwame Nkrumah at the night of independence, declaring independence for Ghana. Next slide, please. But it is independence based on this colonial constitution. And so what happens very quickly thereafter is that you get this new process of what I call republic. If you go back one slide, sorry. What I call Republican and one-party state constitutions. So this is what happens very quickly. But the key to this process, in terms of a process of constitution making, is when the constitutions, the independence constitutions, are created by the colonial power, negotiated with the nationalist leaders, whose first goal, of course, is independence. They pay less attention to the details of the constitution because their goal is firstly to get independence. The process that then follows is once they inherit these constitutions, they proceed to transform their national legislatures into constituent assemblies. So the colonially created National Assembly then gets just reimagined as a constitutional assembly for writing these new Republican constitutions. So next slide, please. So here is the Ghanaian Parliament producing in 1960 the first Republican constitution for Ghana. Now, what's important about these Republican constitutions that get adopted, of course, they get rid of the Queen. They make sure the head of state now becomes the president. But what they do as well is they reproduce the independence constitution's format, which basically grants the executive enormous powers. So the same powers that the colonial governor had, incorporated for the president, for the prime ministers or heads of government in the transition to independence, then gets replicated and in fact enhanced by the Republican constitutions that follow. So right throughout, and some of these constitutions are adopted in the most extraordinary ways. So Milton Obote in Uganda literally produced something which was called the Pigeonhole Constitution, because the members of the Ugandan parliament found the constitution completely made in their pigeonholes in parliament before they had to vote on it, without ever getting to read it. And so the notion of constitution making at this point is really just an assertion by these new executives, these powerful new executives of power. Of course, we can understand the power of these executives at this time. These were the nationalist leaders who led the continent to independence, had an enormous amount of credibility at first with their populations, and could push for this domestication of the constitution in this way. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So in Ghana, for instance, shortly after the 1960 constitution, 3 years later, the country holds a referendum, and the referendum declares that, first of all, Nkrumah will be president for life, and secondly, declares that there will be a one-party state. And so you get the emergence of the one-party states. Here's a wonderful statement by Nyerere, who says the United States is also a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them, which I just think is a fabulous statement by Nyerere. But there is this, Nyerere gets the party to set up a commission to decide whether there'd be a one-party state, but in the end, the commission has no real role, and they adopt a one-party state as a party decision. Kaunda in Zambia literally has a press conference where he announces that they will be becoming a one-party state. And very quickly, the parliament adopts the rules of a one-party state, which prohibit other political parties or even expressions of opposition. So next. So this is the emergence then of these one-party states. Parallel to this, of course, you're also having those series of coups d'etats that I mentioned. And what's fascinating about this is, of course, even though we see the coups as, if you like, unconstitutional or illegal adoptions of power, very quickly military regimes resort themselves to constitution making. Usually what they do is they appoint a commission, or they set up, they hire a number of lawyers, and they appoint a number of lawyers and political scientists, people from the university, to write a constitution for them. But as Professor Nwebezi pointed out many, many years ago, these military constitution-making processes are completely beholden to the militaries. So the militaries will, even though when they set up processes, even when they set up constituent assemblies themselves, those constituent assemblies were limited in what they could decide, and the military held a final veto over anything that could be included in those constitutions. What's interesting about those constitutions, and we've seen the impact today, is that many of the military adopted constitutions, even the ones that they adopt as they move their countries eventually back to democratic rule, those constitutions, again, strengthen the power of the presidents, strengthen the executive power at the detriment to legislative and other power. And secondly, as they do that, they also put greater entrenchment, and so that the constitutions are harder and harder to change by their own terms. Next slide, please. So again, here, this fascinating thing where, as well beloved as Nkrumah was when he became prime minister and then president of independent Ghana, but in 1966 with the coup, there's popular celebration, and that's the tension which we have to think about. Next slide, please. Now, what's interesting is, so the period from 2003, you can see these coup d'etats don't last very long, but since 2021, they've been sticking around much longer, and there's going to be an interesting part to that. Next slide, please. So if you take the story of Chad, so in 2021 to 2023, you have the military government, and then the president of that transitional military government is Debe. And what's interesting is he then holds an inclusive national dialogue towards a new constitution. Next slide, please. And there he is holding up the new constitution for the country to see. And of course, today, President Debe is the civilianly elected president of Chad. So again, this new process where the constitutions are adopted in a very particular format that allow previous military leaders now to have themselves elected. So one of the questions is, why do they feel the need to be elected? Why do they feel the need? Is it international pressure? Is it domestic pressure? Is it attempts for legitimacy? Next slide, please. And we've seen exactly the same thing going on in Gabon. You have the coup on August 30th, 2023. Again, a lot of popular support for that coup. Next slide. And there, Gabon approves a law allowing the military leader to contest elections. And of course, today, the Gabon's military leader has become the civilian president of Ghana. Of Gabon. Next slide, please. So those are processes that have been producing constitutions, whether it was through these, eventually after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, many of those constitutions, those original military constitutions or the constitutions that came out of the one-party state process, they fall away. Those constitutions quickly get replaced. So what I'm interested in is looking at that process post-1989 and say, what can we learn from that process in terms of the sustainability of this new series of constitutions across Africa? So I'm arguing that these are nationally negotiated. They're not negotiated with a foreign partner. They're nationally negotiated, and they're increasing democratic participation. So next slide, please. So the one example, of course, is South Africa and the democratic transition and public participation. And I'm going to be a little cynical about public participation, but let me show you how it works. Next slide, please. So we have the democratic election in South Africa. And of course, the South African process is a two-stage process. There's an interim negotiated constitution, and that provides for a process to provide for an election, which is what you see on the screen before you. And then the newly elected parliament is what is now becoming the Constitutional Assembly. This time it's an elected Constitutional Assembly that's going to go on and write a future constitution. So there's some hint of those kind of post-independence processes, except, of course, the Constitution is going to be written by the new constitutional body. Next slide, please. And here you see the Constituent Assembly meeting, and the people meet in Parliament as both the lower house and the upper house of the new Parliament meet together as a 400-person Constitutional Assembly. And they had 2 years to write the final constitution for South Africa, what is today the 1996 Constitution. Next slide, please. So here's a famous photo, and not a photo, it was actually a billboard that was put up, and a poster that was published in the media press of advertising something called the Constitutional Assembly Talk Line. So the idea here was to encourage popular participation in the process by having a talk line. So anybody could pick up their phone and leave messages or write or send messages to the Constitutional Assembly in order to have their input. And here, this famous photo, of course, is Nelson Mandela saying, "Hello, is that the Constitutional Talk Line? I'd like to make my submission." And of course, if anybody thinks this is how Mandela made his submission to the constitutional process, that would be a joke, because obviously people in his position had a much more direct access, apart from the fact that it was his party that was dominant in the Constitutional Assembly. So, but this process of public participation did in fact produce an enormous amount of participation. Next slide, please. Here are meetings that were held throughout South Africa where people were asked to give their opinions, to talk about the Constitution, talk about the process that was ongoing. Next slide, please. And of course, they record that 2 million submissions were actually handed into the Constitutional Assembly. At this point, they talk about this moment in. Next slide, please. In fact, the man in the middle is Cyril Ramaphosa, who was chairing the Constitutional Assembly, who in fact is president of South Africa today. But here you can see the offices of the Constitutional Assembly, where people are going through these piles of submissions to try and work out how they can contribute to the process. Of course, many of these submissions were people simply making demands, saying they wanted education for their children, they needed housing. So many of them are just expressions of people's wishes of what they would like a new country to deliver for them. But there were actually many substantive contributions where people were actually suggesting different kinds of constitutional formats. Next slide, please. So here, finally, they produced the working draft. And what was interesting is when that working draft of the Constitution was produced by the Constitutional Assembly, here they're all having a photo outside of Parliament, that um, working draft was published by this paper. The Constitutional Assembly had its own newspaper called Constitutional Talk. And that was distributed throughout the country. So not only on TV and radio, but also hand copies of this were distributed, millions distributed around the country so that people could actually see what the draft looked like as they continued to be part of the process. Next slide, please. And there's Cyril Ramaphosa, Nelson Mandela, Jennifer Nwala holding up the new constitution as it was adopted in March 10th, 1997. And so that's South Africa's process. What's interesting here is the amount of public participation in the process. Did that participation dramatically change what was in the Constitution itself? Probably not much, given that the political party, the African National Congress, had had a long process of discussing constitutional alternatives with its own members and in publicly for some years before this. And so many of these ideas were well formed before the Constitutional Assembly even sat. And so whether these 2 million submissions made that much significant difference, probably not. But the difference they might have made is made the people of South Africa feel that they were part of the process. So that's part of what public participation seems to be doing, is making people feel a certain amount of ownership in the outcome. Next slide, please. So if you've seen that, if that process is what has been fairly, today, Namibia and South Africa, the two first countries along with Ethiopia to have elected constitutional assemblies in Africa, both in both cases of South Africa and Namibia, those constitutions have now lasted longer than most constitutions last around the world. The details of that is internationally, constitutions last approximately 19 years before they're dramatically changed. And so both of these constitutions now since 1990 are over nearly twice that age. Which is something, compared to the coup d'etats that ended constitutions so quickly in the early period of African independence, compared to many other constitutions in Africa and internationally, these have lasted. So that raises the issue of, does participation help? Here in Zambia, you have a process of a campaign for a people-driven constitution in the 1990s, coming up with basic. So one attempt, and I'm going to talk briefly both about Zambia and Zimbabwe, these attempts in the 1990s, following the South African example, to establish processes of public participation, of public demand for constitutional change. Next slide, please. So you get civil society forming these grand coalitions for constitutional change. Next slide, please. So again, demand, there was a draft constitution written, there's coalition demanding that it be released, and these just never happen. Zambia to this day still has the 1991 constitution. So the attempts post the Cold War, they negotiated constitutions to enable democratic multi-party democracies, but then attempts to change them afterwards not really succeeding, even though there's a lot of domestic pressure. Next slide, please. So here again, the National Assembly of Zambia demands for constitutional change. They fail one after another. Next slide, please. There again, this is again various attempts to create dialogues. This is in 2019, again nearly 20 years later, another constitutional amendment bill, but often gets scuttled because there are attempts to change the period, the number of times a president can be elected, and that gets often runs into trouble. Next slide, please. In case of Zimbabwe, if we go to the next slide. So Zimbabwe had tried in the late 1990s to amend its constitution to get rid of the Lancaster House constitution that had been adopted in 1979, 1980 as the country became independent. And so for the first 10 years, they did not change their constitution. But in the early 2000, in the late 1999, they did rewrite that constitution and put it up for referendum. But that referendum failed. The population declined to adopt that constitution because they weren't happy with what ZANU and Mugabe was attempting to do. Decade later, in 2009, civil society mobilizes in Zimbabwe to demand constitutional change. This was after the 2008 disastrous election in 2008, where the amount of violence led Southern African development community to intervene in Zimbabwe, and agreement, something called the Grand Agreement between the parties to achieve a new democratic process. So they created a government of national unity, which between the opposition and Mugabe's party, and they started this constitution-making process. Civil society wanted to control it, so they initiate this process of constitutional reform. Next slide, please. In response to that, what happens is the Mugabe and the government, ZANU, immediately put a process in parliament, create something called the Constitution Select Committee in parliament, and managed to recruit some of the people from the civil society side to participate. And so even though civil society at first objected, this COPAC process became a quite dynamic process that went forward from there. Next slide, please. So COPAC in 2013 produces a draft constitution for Zimbabwe, one that they make sure that Mugabe is not able to change at the last moment. It's not different to what happened in Kenya, where the initial process, the Yashgai's constitution driving process, enormous amount of public participation, but when it went finally to the Kenyan parliament made changes so that once it came out, once it entered the public domain and was put up for a referendum, the people rejected it. Goes back to negotiations, and this is what happened with COPAC in Zimbabwe as well. Goes back to negotiations. So there is this dynamic that's going on between, on the one hand, popular participation, civil society engagement in constitution making, and on the other hand, the political powers that be and the political parties. And unfortunately, neither can be ignored. And so you get this interesting dynamic where you get partly negotiated constitution making together with popular participation. So the next slide, please. And so you get the Constitution of Zimbabwe of 2013, which is the new constitution. Next slide, please. And that gets passed in a referendum. Next slide, please. And so there's a Zimbabwe referendum that then votes by 93% in favor of this constitution. So even though in 2000, the constitution was defeated, by the time they end up this combined negotiated constitution with public participation, you actually get it adopted. What happened, what's interesting in Zimbabwe, next slide, please, is that Mugabe and ZANU worked very hard both to shape this constitution, but also to mobilize people politically. And they get over 1 million more participants in the next election, in the 2014 election, after this constitution's adopted. And ZANU wins a resounding political victory. And so the implementation of this constitution, as good as the constitution is on paper, has been a problem ever since. Next slide, please. And of course, this process of constitution making goes on. Here's a case in 2021, the debates in South Sudan about constitution making. And as we know, there's a new, in Ghana, there's another attempt to do constitutional reform. There's a new constitutional reform commission, which is chaired by my friend, Dr. Prempe. And so we have these ongoing processes of constitution making around Africa. And next slide, please. The question that I still have is, is what amount of process really makes these successful? How much popular participation is required for people to feel that they're part of these constitutions and it's not just a deal made by the political elite? And at the same time, how important it is to actually engage with that political elite so that they feel that they're part of the process as well, or else they, in fact, either will not implement it, as the case is in Zimbabwe, largely unimplemented, and none of the independent institutions created in Zimbabwe have been given the resources or the personnel to make them truly independent. And so the constitutional process remains stymied. It doesn't actually go forward very well. So this debate about constitutionalism in Africa, I think, does begin with how constitutions are actually made and what kind of process gets followed. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to comments, questions from you guys.
Thank you so much, Professor Hans. This is amazing. It's impressive, and I'm always fascinated by the politics of constitutional making, because as part of my dissertation, I worked on the politics of electoral reforms. So,
oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So yeah, that was my dissertation, and I can see how, of course, the constitutions, but also electoral rules are part of a very interesting process of designing the rule of the game. So how much people feel connected with the process, and sometimes they may not be necessarily aware of what is at stake. But the very fact of seeing themselves included in the process, right, give them a sense of ownership. And this idea of ownership is, for me, very important, because that's what determines whether the Constitution is seen as legitimate or not. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, before asking a question, talking a little bit about the experience in Francophone Africa. And of course, this different stage that you mentioned, early independence, but also later on during the transition to democracy. So we've seen a sort of continuity in the constitutional, the constitution itself, but also the content, because the first elite, which drafted our early constitutions, in reality, they tried to pattern these constitutions on what they knew the most. It's the French Fifth Republic, right? Which hasn't really taken into account local and social realities. And even the transition to democracy was no different, because, in fact, it was the kind of Francophone secular elite who designed the constitutions. And we can see how basically they kept this kind of secular values, which in, for example, Muslim majority countries are sometimes very hard to implement. That's why even if the initial constitutions have been adopted, because they involve the participation of some elites with civil society organizations, the kind of emerging civil society organizations, but we've seen that most of the population, at least some strata of the population, are excluded. And it's kind of interesting to see how some actors like, Muslim organizations have tried to challenge these new constitutions, even though they have been adopted through some processes like national conferences, like in Niger and Mali. But even in Niger, the constitution was challenged by some groups who ended up basically imposing to the ruling elite the removal of the word like.
Mm-hmm.
So in Niger, since 1990, the word laicite had been removed because of this pressure from some groups who wants Niger to be, let's say, a Muslim country. But the trade-off was now, well, we're not going to put a republic like, and then they ended up saying, well, now it's an état non-confessional, so it's a non-confessional state. So it's kind of interesting to see this tension in negotiation. And another example that I'm going to give is basically all this debate on the family court. So it's a different thing, but this is just to show how ownership and participation is very important. So throughout the process, of course, religious actors have been involved, but at some point, people started basically debating over whether the constitution or this provision is in line with people's value, right? Like the relationship between, in the family, right? Because we have a paternal authority as opposed to parental authority. So we have this debate going on. And of course, in 2009 in Mali, for example, the family code that had been adopted by the National Assembly was very progressive in some aspects. But some religious clerk challenged this constitution, and they kind of mobilized their followers, and they completely filled a stadium and started basically challenging. And at some point, the president, Amadou Toumani Touré, decided to send the new provision to a second reading. And so you can see how inclusion or non-inclusion can also have a consequence on whether the provision or the constitution is adopted or not. So I really like this kind of your presentation, and it really really in line with the kind of work I've been doing. So, and all this to say that, of course, it's a process, it's not an end point. And there's always tension and negotiations over what to put in the constitution, what to remove, but whether people feel involved or not. And another question I wanted to ask is, I've seen, for example, in all these countries that you mentioned, there's been sometimes some kind of civil society organizations, which really played a very important role, especially when it comes to mediating between the ruling party and the people, right? To what extent civil society organizations use this as a leverage to gain visibility, but also to try to impose some kind of, let's say, agenda. I don't know if there is any kind of agenda behind the fact of positioning themselves as experts, people who are knowledgeable of what's, they're talking about, having workshops, right? So I don't know what, so yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And so first of all, I wish that I was competent in French or other indigenous languages in French speaking Africa, but unfortunately I'm not. And so I'm very reluctant to make too much comments. I have noticed, of course, that those constitutions, the Fifth Republic type constitutions, again, very, just like in France itself, very heavy on the executive, giving enormous powers to the executive as opposed to the legislature, etc. And so there is that frame anyway in those constitutions. But the point that you make about civil society, I think also goes to another point. So civil society throughout Africa is often also very urban-based and very elite-based, to be honest, as well. So it may not be the political elite in the party, but it often is the elite out of whether it's from the churches or from other parts of it. So the question is does civil society represent the majority of people in many African countries? There's an urban-rural division, which has an incredible impact on these processes. How to make sure that people from rural areas can be equally recognized and participate, whether it's in terms of their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, or their sense of their needs that often get ignored in these processes. And so I think you're onto something very important in terms of course, how the electoral system works, but also what is the relationship between political elites. It's complicated in different places. I know the difference often between Francophone Africa and in the Anglophone Africa or Commonwealth Africa is this constitutional recognition of traditional authority in Commonwealth Africa, which allows a rural kind of influence, but in a different way through a very specific mechanism. And the fact that there's less official constitutional recognition of traditional authority, although if you read Afrobarometer, right across Africa, there's still a lot of belief in traditional authority, and sometimes it has more legitimacy than political authority today. And so how do we get these different influences into the process of constitution making in such a way that, as you say, it can be owned by the whole country, that the countries can themselves have a constitution that belongs to the people of the country, and their commitment to it? Because why use it? Why try and operate the rule of law through a constitution if it doesn't feel like it's yours? It feels like it's far away from you. Either that it's somebody else's agenda, as you point out, whether domestic or international, or it's in some way not reflecting cultural and other needs locally. And so a legitimate constitution, one that's going to last, has to incorporate that. I think one of the interesting reasons why the South African constitution has lasted so long post 1994 has been the kind of cultural nature of South Africa, that there's so many different interests and influences. And even though the African National Congress was a dominant party for so long, I mean, in the last election, the ANC only got 40%. And so Cyril Ramaphosa is now having to run a minority government, or government of national unity is the only way he gets the majority. And so the constitution becomes increasingly important as something to rely upon. And again, it's very different. Now, there was a question in the chat, and I know we're running out of time. There's a question in the chat about the way this kind of Africans looking to the military leader of Burkina Faso as somehow somebody who offers a new alternative to Africa. And I think I'd fall back on Ben Nwabezi's great contribution, the Nigerian constitutionalist, who points out that, at first, many of these military leaders come into power with great hope, because one of the reasons they've been able to grab power is that the population is not happy with the civilian leadership. The democracy has failed in its own terms to deliver the kinds of life that people are looking for, whether it's through employment or many other needs that people have. And the result is the military leader can promise to deliver these things. In the case of the Sahel now, these military leaders promising to deliver peace. The question is when they cannot deliver after a certain amount of time, what is the response? The response isn't another democratic election where they can throw out the leadership, as Ghana was able to do in December 2024. But the response is that the military then doubles down and refuses to listen and becomes more and more authoritarian. So even though there's a lot of hope, or seemed to be a lot of hope at first in some of these new military leaders, I would caution that over time I worry that that hope will be dashed on the rocks, just like previous attempts were.
If I can follow up quickly, so what are some patterns you might think are it's history repeating itself? You mentioned that once there's no re-election, and then they just hold on to power. But as far as a positive trend or maybe a negative trend, just that, like right now, it seems like everyone is really obsessed with infrastructure and the way he's doing it. He's buying or winning hearts and minds, as they might say in the military. But yeah, thank you, sir.
So I have no doubt that he will try to win hearts and minds. And the question is when you have frustration, when you cannot do it, the truth is if he manages to deliver for the people, then for as long as he's delivering, he'll have support. That's not unusual. That's the same like a democracy is supposed to work. The problem is how quickly they become isolated and live in their own bubble and don't actually see the people anymore. And that's the moment when things become increasingly repressive. And that's the moment not to see.
One last follow-up. In relations to removing France or other Western powers, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do not think France has done any good in Sub-Saharan Africa ever. So so in the sense of getting the French out, that's probably not a bad thing. The trouble is not what you get out, is what you get in. What are you offering as the alternative? The introduction of Russian mercenaries and the kind of massacres that have been going on in some countries as a result is clearly not the solution, and is clearly not a better alternative to even the French. So I would worry about what the alternatives are. If the alternatives were a genuine Malian or Nigerian community that could stand up by itself, I would be all in support of that. But I'm very suspicious that that is not what is going on even now.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you, Abdi, for your question. Very, very interesting. We're very sorry. We have another seminar coming up.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the glitch with the PowerPoint, but I really appreciated your help.
No, it was amazing, Heinz. Heinz, do you mind if I post your PowerPoint on the platform?
No, you're welcome to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I don't think it doesn't actually explain itself. It's not one of those kinds of PowerPoints. It has very little detail. So I'm not sure it'd be useful to people, but I don't object.
All right, thank you very much. But anyway, anyhow, we'll have the recording of the session and we'll post it. We'll post it on the platform.
Oh, please get and send me a link.
Yeah, sure. Will do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting.
Oh, I'm glad it was useful.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.